I woke up before my alarm and stared at the ceiling, my heart beating like it already knew something was wrong. "Today's the day," I whispered, smiling to myself. My phone buzzed and I grabbed it fast. "You awake?" Jake texted. I typed back, "Barely slept." He replied, nervous groom energy. I laughed and said, "I trust her. Everything's perfect." My mother knocked and said, "Breakfast is ready." I answered, "Coming." She looked at me and asked, "You okay?" I said, "I've never been better." I believed that. I kept checking my phone. No message from Emily yet, but that was normal. She liked quiet mornings. I told myself, she's just busy. At the venue, Jake adjusted my tie and said, "Man, you're really doing this." I said, "She's my forever." He raised an eyebrow. "You sound sure." I smiled. "I am." Guests started arriving. I heard whispers and laughter. My phone stayed silent. I texted Emily, "Good morning, beautiful." No reply. I told Jake, "She'll text soon." The wedding planner walked over and asked, "Has the bride arrived?" I said, "Not yet." She smiled politely. "We're running a little behind." 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Jake said, "You want me to call her?" I shook my head. "I'll do it." I called. It went to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. My chest tightened. My phone buzzed finally. I smiled too fast and opened the message. Emily wrote, "I'm sorry. I can't do this." I felt the room tilt. I typed, "What do you mean?" Seconds felt like hours. Another message came. "I'm leaving. I'm with someone else." I whispered. "No," Jake asked. "What's wrong?" I showed him the phone. He swore under his breath. I called Emily again. This time she answered. I said, "Where are you?" She said, "Please don't yell." I said, "Just tell me." She sighed and said, "I'm with Richard." My voice cracked. "Your boss." She said, "He understands me." I said, "I loved you." She replied, "I'm sorry." I could hear cars outside and music inside, but it all felt far away. I asked, "Since when?" She said, "It's been months." I said, "You let me plan a wedding." She said, I didn't know how to stop. My hands shook. I said, "So this is it?" She answered, "Yes." I ended the call and stared at the wall. Jake said, "Say the word, and I'll kick someone." I said, "It's over." My mother came in and asked, "Where's Emily?" I couldn't answer. Jake said quietly, "She's not coming." My mother covered her mouth. Guests began murmuring. I heard my name spoken with pity. I felt naked in my suit, like everyone could see my shame. I thought, I trusted her with everything. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I walked outside and breathed in cold air. I told myself, this is real. My wedding day ended without a wedding, and my life split into before and after. Jake followed me and said, "Talk to me." I said, "I don't know how." He said, "You didn't deserve this." I laughed bitterly and said, "Apparently I did." My phone rang again. It was Emily. I declined the call. Jake asked, "You sure?" I said, "If I hear her voice, I'll break." The wedding planner stepped outside and said, "We need a decision." I said, "Cancel it." She hesitated and said, "I'm so sorry." I nodded. Inside, chairs scraped and people stood up confused. An uncle asked, "Is everything okay?" I said, "No, but it will be." The words felt fake, but I said them anyway. My father pulled me aside and said, "Son, look at me." I met his eyes. He said, "This isn't your fault." I said, "She chose him." He said, "That says more about her." I swallowed and said, "I thought love was enough." He replied, "Love also needs honesty." I sat alone in the dressing room. My phone buzzed again with a long message from Emily. I didn't open it. I said out loud, You made your choice. My reflection looked older already. I loosened my tie and whispered, I trusted the wrong person. The room was quiet, but my head was loud. I realized this pain would change me, even if I didn't know how yet. I stood up, wiped my face, and said, This isn't the end. My voice shook, but the promise stayed. Something inside me broke, and something harder quietly took its place today alone. I met Emily that night in a quiet parking lot behind the hotel. I said, You couldn't even face me? She crossed her arms and said, I didn't know how. I laughed once and said, You planned a wedding but not a goodbye. She said, Please don't do this. I replied, You already did. She looked away and said, I felt trapped. I said, With me? She nodded. I loved you, but it felt small. My chest burned. I asked, Small how? She said, Dreams, money, future. I said, You never told me. She answered, You wouldn't have understood. I whispered, You never let me try. I asked, When did it start? She hesitated. I said, Tell me. She sighed and said, Months ago. I clenched my fists. While you smiled at me? She said, I didn't mean to hurt you. I snapped, You practiced lying. She flinched. Richard listened. He showed me a different life. I said, He showed you his wallet. She said, He made me feel safe. I replied, I wasn't enough. She looked at me and said, Not anymore. Those words landed hard. I thought, I built my life around her. I said, You believed in him more than me. She said, He's powerful. I asked, And I'm weak? She didn't answer. I said, Did you love him? She said, I don't know. I laughed bitterly. You ruined my life for I don't know. She said, Stop. I said, You let me invite my family. She said, I'm sorry. I replied, Sorry doesn't erase humiliation. My voice shook. Everyone watched me wait. She said, I felt guilty every day. I said, Not guilty enough. She stepped closer. I never meant for it to go this far. I said, You let it go far. She said, He promised stability. I asked, So I was just practice? She whispered, No. I said, That's how it feels. I thought about every late night I worked, every promise I made. I said, You never believed I'd succeed. She said, I was scared. I said, So you chose someone safe. She nodded slowly. Richard knows what he wants. I said, And you know what I wanted? She looked down. I wanted more. I asked, Did you ever plan to tell me? She said, After the wedding. I stared at her. You would have married me while loving him? She said, I was confused. I said, You were selfish. She whispered, Maybe. That word hurt worse than anger. I realized I loved someone who never chose me. I said, You didn't just leave me. She asked, What do you mean? I said, You erased me. She wiped her eyes. I never wanted you to feel worthless. I laughed softly. Too late. I felt rage and shame mix. I wasn't enough because I wasn't rich. She said, It wasn't just money. I said, Then why him? She said, He opens doors. I said, And I was a wall? She said, Please stop. I said, No, I need this. My heart pounded. You chose him because you don't believe in slow growth. She said nothing. I asked, What does he say about me? She hesitated. I said, Tell me. She said, He said you'd never be more. I closed my eyes. That sentence stayed. I thought she believed him. I opened my eyes and said, That's the difference. She asked, What? I said, I believed in you. She reached for me. I stepped back. Don't. She said, I still care. I replied, Care didn't stop you. I took a breath. I don't know who I am now. She said, you'll move on. I said, not from this. I walked away before she could speak again. My legs felt heavy. I thought, my future died today. I sat in my car and stared ahead. I didn't cry. I felt empty. I said to myself, she never saw my worth. That truth hurt, but it was clear. I drove off alone, carrying a life I no longer recognized. I woke up on Jake's couch with a headache and said, I need water. Jake stood over me and said, you need help. I laughed dryly. Same thing. He crossed his arms. You didn't go to work again. I said, what's the point? He snapped. You still have a job. I said, for now. At work later, my manager said, you're late. I replied, traffic. He said, sit down. I could hear coworkers whispering. Someone said, that's the guy who got dumped at the altar. Another voice said, pathetic. I stared at my screen and thought, they're right. My phone buzzed with a bill reminder. I muttered, great. That night, Jake said, you've been drinking every day. I said, it helps me sleep. He replied, it helps you hide. I snapped, stop acting like you know. He said calmly, I know you. That made me quiet. I poured another drink and said, I can't afford rent. He said, you can stay here. I shook my head. I don't want pity. At a bar, a stranger asked, weren't you supposed to get married? I said, not anymore. He laughed and said, guess she found better. I finished my drink and left. Outside, I thought, everyone knows. My phone showed an old photo of Emily smiling. I whispered, I missed so much. I remembered her late nights and secret calls. I told Jake. She never believed in me. He said, that doesn't define you. I replied, it feels like it does. He said, you're letting her win. I scoffed. She already won. He said, only if you stay like this. I didn't answer. I stared at the floor and felt small. At work, my manager called me in again. Your performance is slipping. I said, I know. He said, fix it or leave. I nodded. Walking out, I heard someone say, he's broken. I thought, they can see it. I skipped lunch and sat alone, replaying Emily's words. Not enough. That sentence burned. That night, I packed a bag. Jake asked, where are you going? I said, anywhere else. He said, running won't fix you. I replied, staying hurts. He said, you're allowed to hurt. I dropped the bag. I don't know how to stop. He put a hand on my shoulder. One day at a time. I looked around the room and said, I lost everything. Jake said, you lost her. I said, she was my future. He replied, your future isn't a person. I sighed. It feels empty. He said, empty can be filled. I laughed softly. With what? He said, with you. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling again. I thought about leaving the city, changing my name, disappearing. I whispered, I'm tired. My chest hurt, but something else stirred. I thought, I'm still here. That idea surprised me. I wasn't healed. I wasn't strong. But I wasn't gone. And somehow, that felt like the start. I attended a work conference feeling invisible and emotionally exhausted. Jake insisted I go, saying hiding would only ruin me. At registration, a woman said, you're the keynote assistant, right? I nodded and said, yes, that's me. Quietly embarrassed today. She smiled awkwardly and said, I'm Claire Wallace. Nice meeting. My stomach dropped when I heard her last name clearly. I said, I know who your father is already today. Claire sighed and replied, I know who you are too. I tensed, waiting for judgment or cruel amusement, instead silently. She said, I'm sorry for what happened to you there. I laughed nervously and said, you don't owe me that. Claire looked serious and said, I really mean it honestly. We sat during lunch, surrounded by people pretending not watching. I said, "Your father destroyed my life completely yesterday emotionally." She nodded and said, "I don't defend his choices ever." I asked, "Why are you talking to me then now?" Claire said, "Because you look like someone drowning quietly inside." I felt exposed and said, "I'm fine, really today okay?" She raised an eyebrow and said, "That's a lie though." I sighed and said, "I don't know who I am." Claire replied, "You're more than what my father did wrong." Her words made me uncomfortable, hopeful, and suspicious simultaneously today. I asked, "Do you hate him truly now inside today?" Claire hesitated and said, "I hate who he becomes sometimes." I nodded slowly, understanding complicated family pain too well now. She looked at me and said, "Stop punishing yourself anymore." I said, "I trusted the wrong person deeply, completely blindly." Claire replied, "That doesn't make you weak or stupid ever." Her kindness confused me more than cruelty ever did before. I said, "Your last name scares me honestly still today." Claire smiled sadly and said, "It scares me too sometimes." We sat quietly, tension mixing with unexpected understanding between us. I realized she saw me, not a broken headline anymore. She stood and said, "Take care of yourself please now." I watched her walk away, feeling lighter and conflicted inside. I kept running into Claire after the conference, like the city was forcing us together. She said one afternoon, "You look less tired today." I replied, "That's not saying much." She smiled slightly and said, "Still honest at least." We sat across from each other at a cafe. I said, "People are staring." She shrugged. "They always do." I asked, "Because of your father?" She said, "Because of his shadow." I took a breath and said, "Why do you keep talking to me?" Claire stirred her coffee and said, "Because you don't lie about pain." I said, "Pain isn't a skill." She replied, "It's a language." I laughed quietly. "I'm fluent then." She looked at me and said, "My father hates that." I asked, "Hates what?" She said, "People who can't be bought." I leaned back and said, "He bought my fiancée." Claire winced. "I know." I asked, "Does that bother you?" She said, "It disgusts me." I nodded. "You're his daughter." She said, "That doesn't mean I'm him." I paused and said, "You don't defend him." She replied, "I survived him." I asked, "What does that mean?" She said, "Control, expectations, threats." I frowned. "He threatens you?" She said, "With money, silence, approval." I said, "Sounds familiar." She smiled sadly. "That's why I trust you." I shook my head. "I'm not trustworthy right now." She said, "You're broken, not dangerous." The words hit me harder than anger ever did. I said, "I don't want revenge." Claire looked surprised. "You don't." I said, "I want peace." She nodded slowly. "So, do I." We sat in silence until she spoke again. She said, "I need to ask you something." I replied, "That sounds serious." She said, "It is." I watched her carefully and said, "Go on." Claire took a deep breath. She said, "I want out." I asked, "Out of what?" She said, "His control." I said, "That's not simple." She replied, "Nothing worth doing is." I felt uneasy. Where do I fit? She met my eyes. Right here. I laughed once and said, "That didn't explain anything." She said, "Marry me." I froze. "What?" She said, "A legal marriage." I stood up halfway. "Are you serious?" She said, "Completely." I sat back down. "Why me?" She said, "Because he hates you." I said, "That's your reason?" She nodded. "And because you won't use me." I ran a hand through my hair. I said, "This sounds like revenge." She said, "It's independence." I replied, "It could destroy him." She said, He destroyed others first. My chest tightened. I said, I don't want to become him. Claire said softly, neither do I. I asked, what do you gain? She said, freedom. I asked, what do I gain? She answered, a chance to stand up again. I thought about Emily, the whispers, the shame. I said, people will talk. Claire smiled. They already do. I said, I might hate myself later. She said, you already do now. That stung, because it was true. I whispered, is this fake? She said, only at first. I asked, and after? She said, we decide. I closed my eyes and said, this scares me. She replied, good. It should. I opened my eyes and said, no games. She nodded. No lies. I said, no hurting each other. She said, agreed. I exhaled slowly. I said, I won't do this for revenge. She replied, do it for yourself. I felt something shift inside me. I said, I refuse to stay broken. Claire reached out and said, then say yes. I looked at her and said, yes. I ran into Emily outside the grocery store 3 weeks after the engagement news broke. She said, I heard you're engaged. I replied, you heard right. She looked at my hand and said, that was fast. I said, life doesn't wait. She swallowed and asked, can we talk? I nodded. 5 minutes. We stood near the parking lot. She said, you look different. I said, I feel different. She laughed nervously. Is she a rebound? I met her eyes. No. She said, you don't even sound angry. I replied, I used to be. She asked, don't you hate me? I said, I don't trust you. That answer shook her. She said, I made a mistake. I said, you made a choice. She whispered, I thought I wanted more. I said, you wanted easier. She flinched. You're cruel now. I shook my head. I'm honest. She said, Richard didn't turn out how I hoped. I said, that's not my problem. She stepped closer. I miss you. I stepped back. You miss safety. She said, I think about our wedding. I replied, I don't. That wasn't fully true, but it felt right. She said, you used to fight for me. I said, I fight for myself now. Her eyes filled. Do you love her? I answered, I respect her. She said, that's not love. I replied, it's stronger. She asked, is this revenge? I said, no. She whispered, then why her? I said, because she didn't lie. Emily looked small suddenly. She said, I ruined everything. I replied, you taught me everything. She asked, can we start over? I said, no. She nodded slowly. I understand. I said, I hope you do. I walked away without looking back. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. Claire texted, dinner tonight? I typed, yes. She replied, you okay? I answered, I faced my past. She sent, proud of you. At dinner, Claire said, you're quiet. I said, I saw Emily. She stiffened. And I said, it's done. She asked, do you need space? I shook my head. I need honesty. She smiled softly. I can do that. I said, this marriage scares me. She said, me too. I said, I don't want lies. She replied, I won't pretend. I said, I don't want games. She said, I hate games. I said, I don't want to hurt you. She answered, then don't disappear. I looked at her and said, I'm still healing. She nodded. So am I. I said, this isn't a fairy tale. She smiled. Good. I asked, what are your rules? She said, respect and choice. I said, mine too. She added, and honesty, even when it's ugly. I replied, especially then. Later that night, I lay awake thinking. I thought about silence and strength. I thought about how calm felt powerful. I realized revenge had a voice, but peace was quiet. Emily heard my silence and lost access to me. Claire heard my truth and stayed. The next morning, Emily texted once more. She wrote, "I wish you happiness." I typed, "I wish you growth." I didn't wait for a reply. I stood by the window and said to myself, I survived. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't empty either. I finally understood something simple and solid. Moving forward without regret hurt less than holding on. I woke up before sunrise and said to myself, this feels different. There was no panic, no crowd, no forced smile waiting. Claire knocked and asked, "You awake?" I said, "Yeah." She stepped in and said, "Still sure?" I nodded. More than I expected. She sat across from me and said, "I'm nervous." I replied, "Me too." She smiled slightly. "That helps." I said, "This isn't a fairy tale." She answered, "It's better." I looked at her and said, "Thank you." She asked, "For what?" I said, "For choosing honesty." We dressed in silence until she said, "He'll be here." I said, "I know." She asked, "Do you want me there?" I shook my head. "I'll handle him." She touched my arm. "You don't owe him anything." I said, "I owe myself this." Richard stopped me near the entrance. He said, "Enjoying your moment?" I replied, "I am." He smirked. "This won't end well for you." I said, "Threats don't scare me anymore." He stepped closer. "You think this marriage protects you?" I said, "It reminds me who I am." He laughed. "You're still nothing." I met his eyes. "Not to myself." He said, "Claire deserves better." I answered, "She chose better." His smile faded. "You'll regret this." I said calmly, "I already survived worse." He walked away angry. I felt steady. Claire found me and asked, "You okay?" I said, "I stood my ground." She smiled. "I knew you would." The ceremony was small and quiet. No whispers, no pity, no pressure. Claire whispered, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever this becomes, thank you." I replied, "We'll let it be real." As vows began, I thought about my past wedding plans. I remembered fantasy and blind hope. This moment felt honest and grounded. I said, "I promise respect." Claire said, "I promise truth." Those words felt heavy and right. When the officiant said, "You may kiss," I hesitated, then leaned in gently. Claire whispered, "That was enough." I smiled. Agreed. After, Jake hugged me and said, "You look solid." I said, "I feel it." He said, "Proud of you." I replied, "I finally am." Later, Claire and I stood alone. She said, "This isn't perfect." I said, "It's real." She asked, "Do you regret it?" I said, "No." She smiled. "Neither do I." That night, I looked at my reflection again. I didn't see a victim or a groom chasing love. I saw a man choosing dignity over desperation. I whispered, "This is enough." I heard about Richard's fall from Jake before I read it anywhere else. Jake said, "Have you seen the news?" I replied, "I stopped checking." He said, "Your father-in-law is in trouble." I said, "He's not my anything." Jake laughed. "Fair enough." We sat in his kitchen, and he said, "Fraud investigation." I asked, "Serious?" He nodded. "Very." I leaned back and said, "I didn't touch anything." Jake said, "That's the best part." I replied, "I don't feel happy." He frowned. "You're allowed to." I said, "I feel calm." Later, Claire showed me an article on her phone. She said, "It's happening." I asked, "Are you okay?" She took a breath. Relieved. I said, "Not sad." She said, I grieved him years ago. I nodded. That makes sense. She sat beside me and said, he did this to himself. I replied, that's how karma works. She smiled slightly, quietly. I said, no explosions. She said, no blood. I added, just consequences. A week later, Emily called. I almost didn't answer. I said, hello. She sounded tired. Hi. I asked, what do you need? She hesitated. I lost my job. I said, I'm sorry. She whispered, Richard blamed me. I stayed silent. She said, I thought he'd protect me. I replied, that was never who he was. She asked, are you happy? I said, I'm at peace.
She paused.
With her? I answered, with myself. She started crying. I said, Emily, listen. She sniffed. I know. I said, I can't save you. She said, I wasn't asking. I replied, good. She whispered, I regret everything. I said, I believe you. She asked, do you forgive me? I thought for a moment. I said, I forgive myself. She was quiet. Then she said, goodbye. I replied, goodbye. I told Claire about the call that night. She asked, did it reopen wounds? I said, no. She smiled. That's growth. I said, I didn't feel powerful. She asked, what did you feel? I answered, free. We walked through the city together. Claire said, people think karma is revenge. I said, it's release. She nodded. You don't need them to lose. I said, I just needed to stop losing myself. She squeezed my hand. Jake joined us for dinner later. He said, so the villain falls. I replied, he slipped. Jake said, still satisfying. I shook my head. It's quiet. Claire said, that's better. Jake raised his glass. To closure. I said, to peace. Claire added, to choosing differently. We clinked glasses. That night, I sat alone on the balcony. I thought about how angry I used to be. I remembered wanting answers and apologies. Now I didn't need them. The noise inside me was gone. Claire came out and asked, thinking? I said, reflecting. She leaned on the railing. Any regrets? I replied, I stayed. She smiled. You changed. I said, so did you? She asked, do you ever wish it hurt them more? I shook my head.
No.
She said, why? I answered, because their pain isn't my healing. I looked out at the city lights and felt complete. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I let go. I stood by the window that morning and said to myself, this is quiet. Claire walked up behind me and asked, good quiet or heavy quiet? I smiled and said, honest quiet. She leaned beside me and said, I like that. I nodded. So, do I. We made coffee together and she said, do you ever think about before? I replied, less than I used to. She asked, does it still hurt? I said, sometimes, but it doesn't control me. She smiled. That's different. I said, that's growth. I sat down and said, I lost a future I planned. Claire said, you gained one you chose. I thought about that and said, I lost blind trust. She replied, you gained self-respect. I laughed softly. You're good at this. She said, I had practice surviving. I looked at her and said, this started as an agreement. She nodded. It did. I asked, when did it change? She said, when you stopped trying to prove anything. I said, I stopped running. She smiled. Exactly. Later, I sat alone and thought about my past self. I whispered, you did the best you could. I remembered begging for answers and blaming myself. I said out loud, you weren't weak. That felt important. I felt something settle inside me. Claire joined me again and said, "You look lighter." I replied, "I forgave someone." She asked, "Who?" I said, "Me." She nodded slowly. "That's the hardest one." I said, "I don't hate Emily anymore." Claire said, "That doesn't mean she was right." I said, "It means I'm done." She smiled. "I'm glad." I added, "I don't need her regret." Claire replied, "You never did." We walked outside together. I said, "I thought love meant sacrifice." She said, "It means choice." I said, "I chose myself." She answered, "And you chose me." I looked at her. I did. I remembered the man I was at the altar waiting. I said, "He thought love was enough." Claire said, "He wasn't wrong." I shook my head. He just didn't know love includes dignity. She squeezed my hand. Jake called later and said, "You sound different." I replied, "I am." He asked, "Happy ending?" I said, "Real ending." He laughed. "That's better." I said, "Thanks for not giving up on me." He replied, "You never actually did." That night, Claire and I sat quietly. She said, "Do you ever regret how we started?" I thought and said, "No." She asked, "Why?" I said, "Because we chose honesty after." She smiled. "That matters." I said, "I don't need revenge." She said, "You never really wanted it." I replied, "I wanted my life back." She answered, "And you took it." I looked at the city lights and said, "I'm not defined by betrayal." Claire said, "You're defined by what you became." I took a breath. I felt whole. I said, "I survived." She replied, "You lived." I corrected, "I chose." She smiled and said, "That's the difference." I went to bed that night without anger or fear. I thought about everything I lost. I honored it. Then I thought about everything I gained. I stood taller inside. I didn't win by revenge. I won by learning. I won by staying. I won by choosing myself.